The moment the ship docked in New York Harbor, the world seemed to hold its breath. The clatter of chains and the sharp commands of American guards pierced the thick silence that had settled over the German prisoners of war. They stood frozen at the edge of the ship's deck, their backs rigid, eyes wide, each man struggling to reconcile the disorienting reality they were now facing. For most of them, this was the first time they had set foot on American soil. For others, the journey had been one of bitter captivity, a long, treacherous passage across the sea. But now, as they disembarked and were led through the immense docks of the harbor, nothing could prepare them for the sheer magnitude of what lay ahead. Among the group was Karl Weber, a seasoned officer in the German army. Karl had fought through some of the most brutal battles on the Eastern Front, had seen his comrades fall under the crushing weight of Soviet artillery, and had survived the hardships of countless skirmishes and ambushes. Yet as he stepped off the ship and onto American soil, he felt something he had never experienced before: uncertainty. The harsh sounds of the harbor, cranes unloading cargo, the distant hum of steam engines, did not just signify the arrival of a ship, but rather a new world. It was a world that Karl had only heard whispers of in the POW camps, a world where rumors of American might, industry, and power seemed more like stories of another era. Too grand to be true. Yet now, standing amidst the towering cranes and bustling workers, the palpable sense of industrial force could not be ignored. The prisoners were herded into trucks, and as the vehicles rumbled down the city streets, Karl watched in stunned silence. The city of New York sprawled out before him, its skyline jagged against the sky. The towers reached far above, casting long shadows across the street, as if the city itself were some colossal machine, a city that never slept, never stopped, but pulsed with energy at every moment. The streets were packed with cars, trucks, and people, every inch of the city alive with purpose. Karl's thoughts raced. The war had been hard, filled with sacrifices, ideals, and dreams of glory. But now, looking out at the unrelenting flow of life in the heart of America, he wondered if they had ever stood a chance. This was not the war they had been prepared for. The enemy was not just a military force. They were a nation, a living, breathing industrial machine that seemed to churn out its own future with a terrifying efficiency. They were driven through the streets, and it wasn't long before the enormity of what Karl had only read about began to take shape before him. As the trucks rolled through the outskirts of the city and into the industrial heartland, it was impossible to ignore the monstrous factories that lined the horizon. Their enormous smokestacks loomed over the landscape like giants, belching black smoke into the sky. Karl's stomach tightened as they passed steel mills, refineries, and warehouses, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning fuel and metal. In the back of the truck, the other prisoners sat in silence, their expressions grim. They had heard stories of what America could do, of its industrial power, but none of them had truly grasped it. Karl had been skeptical at first, dismissing the tales as propaganda, but now, in the heart of the nation that had seemingly turned the tide of war, he could no longer deny the truth. This was no ordinary country. This was a nation that had turned industry itself into a weapon. As the truck pulled into the compound, a vast, sprawling complex of steel and iron, Karl's mind raced. He had known that his nation had been at war with the United States, but he had never fully understood the depth of their capability. The sheer scale of everything around him, the factories, the machines, the workers, was overwhelming. They were herded off the trucks and directed toward a large building. Inside, they were met by a man in a crisp American military uniform who spoke in a calm, measured voice. "Welcome to America's war effort. You will witness firsthand the power of this nation's industry. It is your new reality." The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. Karl's heart began to race as he realized that he wasn't just a captive in this foreign land. He was about to witness something far beyond the scope of anything he had ever imagined. A machine that could outproduce any enemy, a country that could sustain an entire war effort with the click of a button and the hum of its engines. As they were led into the factory complex, the noise hit them immediately. A deafening roar of machinery, the rhythmic hum of assembly lines, the pounding of metal on metal. Karl's eyes darted around, taking in the sight of massive machines moving in sync, workers operating them with precision and efficiency. It was as if the factory itself had come alive, and the soldiers were merely observers to this massive, unyielding beast. Carl swallowed hard. He had fought through endless battles, seen countless weapons, and commanded men in the most desperate of circumstances. But here, in the belly of this industrial titan, he realized that the true force of war was not in the guns and tanks. It was in the machines. America wasn't just fighting a war. They were waging a war of production, a war of resources that could keep fueling itself long after his comrades had fallen. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a massive machine starting up, its engines shaking the floor beneath him. The vibrations reverberated through his bones. For a moment, Carl felt as if the factory was swallowing him whole. The Americans had promised them a tour, but Carl wasn't sure he could take it all in. The realization was too much to bear. This wasn't a war of ideology or strategy anymore. This was a war of industry, and America had perfected the craft. With a deep breath, Carl steadied himself. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew this. He had entered a world where he was no longer just a soldier, and the battlefield had shifted. The tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating. He could feel it pressing against him. The reality was setting in. America's war machine was alive, and it was stronger than anything he had ever imagined. The tour had just begun, but Carl knew this. He wasn't prepared for what lay ahead, and neither was anyone else. The factory floor was alive with noise. Machines thrummed, metal clanged, and workers moved with fluid precision. The sound of their labor was deafening, but Carl Weber had already become numb to it. The weight of what he had seen the day before still hung over him like a cloud, and no matter how many times he blinked, it did not dissipate. There were no words to capture the magnitude of what the Americans had built here, no way to explain the terror it instilled in him. He had spent his life in the German army, training to fight with honor, with purpose. But here, surrounded by the immense scale of the American industrial war machine, honor and purpose seemed irrelevant. His purpose, his belief in a cause greater than himself, had been shattered, destroyed in the grinding roar of the machines that were producing weapons, tanks, and planes at a rate that boggled the mind. Carl's mind was consumed with a single thought. How could Germany have ever thought they could win this war? How could they possibly have been prepared for a force like this? The American officer leading them through the factory, Major Thomas Clark, smiled politely as he continued his explanations, seemingly unaware of the prisoner's growing discomfort. This, he said with a sweeping gesture, is the heart of America's victory. We call it the arsenal of democracy. His voice was warm, but Carl could hear the underlying pride in it. Pride in the power that had turned the tide of the war. Pride in the systems that had made America a superpower. The prisoners had been told they were here to witness America's might, but Carl now felt as though they were being shown the very thing that had defeated them. Major Clark paused in front of a row of workers assembling artillery shells, their hands moving as if part of a machine itself. You see, gentlemen, the beauty of our system lies in its simplicity. We do not fight one battle at a time. We fight a war of production. It is in the factories, in the foundries, that wars are won. Carl felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He was a soldier. He had been trained for combat, for strategy, for battle plans. But this was something else entirely. This was not just about fighting on a battlefield. It was about overwhelming an enemy with the sheer power of industry. America had mastered it, and he was helpless to understand how Germany could ever have competed. But it wasn't just the factories that unsettled him. It was the workers. The Americans worked with such efficiency, such focus, that Carl couldn't help but wonder if they were even human anymore. They moved like cogs in the very machines they operated, precise, unwavering, and relentless. It was a far cry from the camaraderie and unity he had once felt with his own men in the field. Here, the workers didn't seem to fight for ideals or glory. They fought for productivity, for the machine. Carl's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of one of the other prisoners, Friedrich, a young medic who had been captured in Italy after a failed assault on the Allied lines. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a mix of awe and fear as he stepped forward, his voice shaking. How can they do this? Just build and build and build without stopping? Friedrich had always been a quiet, thoughtful man, rarely speaking out of turn, always quick to help the wounded and the sick. Karl had come to respect him, though he hadn't had the chance to speak with him much since their capture. But now there was a desperation in his voice that unsettled Karl. "We couldn't have known about this," Friedrich continued, his words barely audible over the roar of the machines. "We had no idea. How could we? How could we have known that they could do this? We were supposed to fight for something greater. But this is something else." Karl didn't have an answer. He couldn't give him one. All he could do was nod in silence, his mind racing. How could they have underestimated America so thoroughly? They had fought so hard, but now it felt as though the war had been lost before it even began. They had fought with tanks, with soldiers, with guns. But America had brought something else entirely, an endless, unstoppable industrial force. As they moved deeper into the factory, Karl felt a tightening in his chest. The noise was deafening now, a constant drone that seemed to reverberate through his very bones. It was as if the factory itself was alive, pulsating with energy. Every machine, every worker, every movement was part of a greater whole, a whole that would never stop, never falter. And the prisoners, Karl included, were simply witnesses to it all. As the group passed another assembly line, Karl saw one of the workers, a young woman, wipe the sweat from her brow as she worked, her hands moving without hesitation as she welded a piece of metal into place. There was a grim determination on her face, but Karl couldn't help but notice the exhaustion in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in the faces of his comrades when they had been pushed to their limits. But here, in this factory, there was no room for fatigue. There was no time for weakness. Only production. Only progress. Karl's stomach twisted in knots. He couldn't help but feel a surge of guilt, of shame. He was a soldier. He had fought for a cause he had believed in, a cause that was now unraveling before him. And these workers, these men and women, were just as much part of the war as he had been. Their work was a different kind of battle, but it was a battle that had been won with incredible efficiency. The reality of it was undeniable. Major Clark, noticing Karl's distracted expression, stopped beside him. "Is everything all right, Lieutenant Weber?" His tone was polite, but there was a hint of curiosity in his voice. Karl looked up, meeting Clark's gaze. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a strange sense of resignation. He nodded curtly. "I'm fine," he muttered. But even as the words left his lips, he knew they weren't true. The truth was, he wasn't fine. None of them were. This place, the scale of it, the relentless push of industry, was breaking them down. The longer they stayed here, the more they felt like nothing more than cogs in a machine. It wasn't just the war they had lost. It was the very notion of what it meant to be human, to be free. As the tour continued, Karl couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something big. The tension in the air had been building, like the quiet before a storm. The workers were moving faster now, their movements more frantic, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. Major Clark had grown quieter, his usual jovial tone replaced by something more serious, as if he were bracing for something. And then, as they rounded a corner, they were confronted by a scene that would stay with Karl for the rest of his life. A massive machine, unlike anything they had seen before, was being tested. It was a war machine, larger than any tank Karl had ever seen, with cannons that could pulverize entire battalions. It stood there, its engine roaring to life, its wheels churning the ground beneath it. The workers were operating it, their hands steady, their faces grim. But it wasn't the machine that took Karl's breath away. It was the sense of purpose in the air. The workers, the engineers, even the soldiers who stood by, observing. They all seemed to know that this was no ordinary weapon. This was the culmination of everything America had built, a symbol of their industrial might, and it was being unleashed into the world. The ground shook beneath them, and Karl could feel it in his chest. This was not just a factory. This was a machine, a beast that could not be stopped. And in that moment, he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The war had taken on a new form, one that no one could fight with guns alone. It was a battle of machines, of industry, and of willpower, and America had already won. The air in the factory had grown thick with tension, and Karl Weber could feel it pressing against him. The tour had been a slow burn of unsettling revelations, but now as he stood in the heart of the factory, surrounded by the American workers, the machines, the tools of war, he felt something new: fear. Fear not for his own safety, but for what was happening in the world. Fear for the future that was being forged right before his eyes. For a moment, Karl felt a tightness in his chest, as if the very walls of the factory were closing in around him. He had spent so many years on the battlefield, had fought in countless engagements, always with a sense of purpose and belief in the cause. But now that belief had crumbled. This was not a war of soldiers. It was a war of industry, of progress, and America had perfected it in ways Germany could never have imagined. How could a nation so vast, so capable, be defeated? It wasn't just a matter of weaponry anymore. It was a matter of resources, of endless machines, and an economy that never stopped producing. Karl's thoughts were interrupted by Major Clark's voice, now more clipped than before. "It's time for the real demonstration," he said, his tone cutting through the murmur of the workers. "Follow me, Lieutenant Weber." Clark led him and the other prisoners through another long corridor, their footsteps muffled by the hum of machinery. As they reached a large steel door, the guards stopped them, giving a final, curt order to stay in place. Karl, however, could feel something more ominous looming. The moment they stepped inside, he knew this was no ordinary test. This wasn't just another machine they were going to show off. This was the future of warfare. They entered a massive chamber where, looming like a mechanical titan, sat a war machine larger than anything Karl had ever imagined. It was an armored vehicle, shaped like a fortress, its cannons heavy and menacing. It stood atop a raised platform, surrounded by engineers and technicians, who were frantically adjusting systems and running diagnostics. Major Clark stepped forward, smiling like a proud parent showing off a newborn child. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce the future of warfare, America's latest creation, the M1 Behemoth." Karl's stomach dropped at the sight. The Behemoth was a mobile fortress, capable of laying waste to entire divisions with its firepower alone. The scale of the weapon left him breathless, his mind unable to fully comprehend how it could even be built, let alone how it could be used. It was a machine of annihilation, and it had been built in the very factory they stood in. But it wasn't just the size of the weapon that disturbed him. It was the implication. This was not the kind of weapon that could be fought with tanks or infantry. It was a symbol of the war America was now waging. Total, overwhelming, unrelenting. This weapon would decimate anything that came its way. The very existence of this machine meant that any hope of a swift resolution to the war, any hope of victory, was slipping through their fingers. "Get a good look, Lieutenant," Clark said, his voice now almost casual. "This is the new face of war. No more trenches, no more stalemates. This is the future." Karl felt a deep, unsettling sense of dread wash over him. He wasn't sure if it was the machine itself, or the fact that they had been brought here to witness its power, but everything about this moment screamed that something was about to shift. Suddenly, the Behemoth's engines roared to life. The ground beneath Karl's feet trembled as the massive machine powered up. The workers in the room scattered, making final adjustments as technicians in protective suits walked cautiously around the vehicle. As the machine began to move, Karl felt an involuntary shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just the size or the power, it was the way it seemed to swallow the air around it, like it was consuming everything in its path. There was no escape from it. It was unstoppable. And that's when the order came. A high-pitched crackle from a speaker, followed by the cold, commanding voice of Major Clark. "Lieutenant Weber, we need you to take command of a mission." The words hit Karl like a physical blow. He had been trained to lead men in battle, to make decisions that would affect the lives of those under his command. But this was different. This wasn't the war he had known. This wasn't a battlefield. This was something else. A mission. And the implications of it were far more dangerous than anything he had faced before. Karl turned slowly to face Clark, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. "A mission? What kind of mission?" Clark's expression darkened. You'll find out soon enough. Before Carl could respond, Clark motioned for two soldiers to step forward. One of them held a map, the other a radio. The mission, as it turned out, was to sabotage a nearby military compound, a target critical to the American war effort. The orders were clear. Carl and a small team of prisoners would be sent behind enemy lines to infiltrate the facility and disable a crucial supply depot. The task was brutal, dangerous, and nearly impossible. But it was not without its purpose. Failure meant certain death. Success, however, could tip the scales in favor of the Germans, at least for a moment. It was a mission that could cripple the American war effort if executed correctly. But as Clark outlined the details, a different reality began to take shape in Carl's mind. He realized with a sinking feeling that this was not an ordinary mission. This was a test of loyalty, of obedience. The choice in that moment became crystal clear. Carry out the mission and play into the hands of the Americans, or refuse and risk everything. The prisoners had been stripped of their autonomy since their capture, and now they were being used as pawns in a much larger game. Carl's thoughts swirled as he weighed his options. He had been trained to fight, to obey orders, to win wars. But could he betray everything he had believed in for the sake of a mission that felt like a trap? Choose wisely, Lieutenant, Clark added coldly, as if reading his mind. You're not in Germany anymore. Here your actions have consequences. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and warp, and Carl could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He had always been a soldier of honor, of purpose. But here, in this place, this industrial behemoth, everything he had known seemed like a distant memory. Friedrich, standing a few paces away, caught his eye. There was something in his gaze, a silent plea. Don't do it, Carl, Friedrich's expression seemed to say. This is wrong. But the tension was rising. The Americans were watching, and Carl knew that refusal was not an option. He felt the heavy pressure of the machine surrounding him, the behemoth, the war, the choices, and suddenly the decision no longer seemed to matter. In that moment, Carl Weber was no longer the officer he had once been. He was a prisoner to a system far larger than himself. With a grim nod, he accepted the mission, the words leaving his lips before he could stop them. I'll do it. Clark smiled, his eyes gleaming with a cold satisfaction. Good. I knew you'd see it our way. But as Carl turned away, a sense of unease settled deep in his gut. He had made a choice, but the true consequences of that decision were still to come. The war was no longer about strategy or victory. It was about survival. And now Carl Weber knew that whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The night was thick with smoke and chaos. The distant thrum of the behemoth's engines echoed through the compound, its massive form an imposing silhouette against the moonlit sky. The mission had begun, but Carl Weber's heart pounded in his chest like a drum, each beat heavier than the last. The plan had seemed so simple on paper: infiltrate the supply depot, disable the American weapons stockpiles, and escape undetected. But as Carl and his small team of prisoners moved through the darkened streets, hidden in the shadows of the massive factories, everything felt like it was slipping through their fingers. The weight of the decision he had made back in the factory was now upon him, an invisible burden that threatened to crush him with every step. His mind raced. The Americans had placed their trust in him, expecting him to carry out the mission without question, but he had already begun to wonder if he had made a grave mistake. The mission was supposed to serve the German cause, but it felt like nothing more than an elaborate test, a trap, and the consequences of failure would be severe, far beyond what he had imagined. The team moved in tight formation, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt beneath their boots. They passed rows of empty buildings, their windows dark and lifeless, each corner an unknown threat. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves in the wind, felt like it could betray them. The silence was deafening. No one spoke. No one dared to move too quickly. Every sound seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the tension of what was about to unfold. Carl's mind flashed back to the factory, the monstrous machine they had seen, the behemoth, its engines a roaring promise of destruction. He had watched it move with a cold, calculated precision, knowing that if it ever crossed into enemy lines, nothing would be left standing in its wake. But now, with the mission at hand, He had one goal: stop that machine before it could be deployed. If he succeeded, it would be a small victory, a glimmer of hope for his comrades. But if he failed, he knew there would be no escape. They reached the perimeter of the supply depot just before dawn. The area was guarded by American soldiers, their movements slow but deliberate. The depot was surrounded by a high barbed wire fence, illuminated by harsh floodlights. Carl's heart raced faster as they crouched low, trying to assess the best way in. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Friedrich, the medic, whispered urgently from beside him. "We have to move fast, Carl. Once we're in, there's no turning back." Carl nodded, his mind clouded with doubt, but there was no time to second-guess himself now. He motioned for the others to follow him, and they moved quickly and quietly, scaling the fence with practiced ease. The clang of metal was drowned out by the sounds of distant trucks rumbling down the road. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before their presence was discovered. Once inside the depot, Carl's team split into pairs. They worked in silence, quickly planting explosives on key supply crates, ensuring that the damage would be catastrophic. Every second counted. But as Carl's hands trembled while wiring the last crate, a cold, chilling thought struck him. What if they were walking into a trap? What if this entire mission was designed not just to test their loyalty, but to set them up as scapegoats for something far more dangerous? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A sudden shout broke his concentration. "Alert! Intruders!" The sound echoed through the compound, and in an instant, chaos erupted. Soldiers poured into the area, their weapons raised, scanning the shadows for any sign of the intruders. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to his team, who were already beginning to retreat. They had to get out. They had to escape before the entire depot was swarming with soldiers. "Fall back!" Carl barked, his voice raw with urgency. But as they sprinted toward the exit, a harsh crackling sound filled the air. Gunfire. The first round grazed Carl's arm, sending him stumbling to the ground. Blood dripped from his wound, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself up. No time to think. No time to feel the pain. They had to move. Friedrich was closest to him, pulling him up. "We're not done yet, Carl. Move!" But just as Carl regained his footing, he heard another cry, a cry of pain. One of the prisoners, Hans, had fallen behind. He was struggling to keep up, clutching his side, blood staining his uniform. The soldiers were closing in, their footsteps heavy and fast. Carl hesitated, his chest tight with indecision. The mission, the escape, everything was hanging by a thread. But then he saw it in Friedrich's eyes, the silent plea. The team could escape, but Hans needed help. Friedrich didn't need to say a word. They both knew the unspoken truth. There was no way they could leave Hans behind. Carl's heart pounded with fear, but he made his choice. "I'll cover you. Get him out of here," he ordered, turning toward the approaching soldiers. Friedrich hesitated, his face torn between loyalty to the mission and to their fallen comrade. But then, without a word, he nodded. He and the rest of the team dragged Hans to his feet and started running for the nearest exit. Carl stood his ground, his rifle raised, heart racing as the first wave of soldiers charged toward him. The sound of gunfire filled the air, ringing in his ears. He fired, taking down the first soldier, but there were too many of them. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. His hand was shaking from adrenaline as he reloaded, his mind screaming at him to run. But he didn't. For the first time since he had been captured, Carl realized what he had become, a man willing to sacrifice everything. His entire life had been shaped by duty, by the ideals of the army. But in this moment, that ideal was shattered. This wasn't about winning a war anymore. It was about doing what was right. It was about saving the men who had fought alongside him. With one final glance at the retreating figures of Friedrich and Hans, Carl turned and ran toward the explosion site, desperate to set the final charge before it was too late. The world seemed to slow around him. He could hear the behemoth's engines roaring to life in the distance, its metal form ready to crush everything in its path. But Carl had one goal: to make sure that it would never move again. If he could stop the behemoth, if he could destroy it before it could unleash its power, perhaps, just perhaps, there could still be a chance to turn the tide. With a final desperate rush, he reached the charge, placed it, and pressed the detonator. The blast that followed shook the very ground beneath him. A massive wave of heat and light engulfed the area, and Carl felt himself thrown to the ground by the force of the explosion. His ears rang, his body burned, but his heart felt a strange sense of peace. He had done it. The behemoth was gone. The mission was complete. But as Carl lay there, his body battered and broken, he knew it wasn't over. The consequences of his actions were still unfolding. The explosion had torn apart the depot, but it had also sealed his fate. There was no turning back now. Through the smoke, he saw Friedrich and Hans, bloodied but alive, running toward him. But Carl could already feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. His legs felt weak, his breath shallow. "I did it," he whispered, a smile tugging at his lips as the world around him faded. "We did it." And with that, Carl Weber, soldier, prisoner, and man of sacrifice, fell into the darkness, knowing that in the end, his choices had made a difference. But the price had been high. The first thing Carl Weber noticed when he regained consciousness was the cold. It was a sharp, biting cold that sliced through his uniform, his skin, straight to his bones. His head throbbed, and his body ached with an intensity that made him wish for the oblivion of unconsciousness. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, almost unresponsive. The world around him was blurry, fragmented. For a moment, Carl thought it was a dream, that the chaos of the last few hours, the explosion, the soldiers, the impossible choices, had all been a figment of his imagination. But then the familiar scent of antiseptic hit his nostrils, and he knew that this was no dream. His eyes opened fully, and he found himself lying in a dimly lit room, the smell of sterile bandages and the faint hum of distant machinery filling the air. He blinked several times, struggling to focus. It wasn't the cold alone that made him shiver. It was the truth. The mission had been a failure. The behemoth had been destroyed, but Carl had paid the price for it. He had sacrificed himself, and in doing so, had put an end to the mission that had once seemed so important. As his eyes adjusted, he saw a figure sitting near his bed, watching him silently. It was Friedrich. His face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed and weary, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. Friedrich's voice, low and rough, broke the silence. "Carl, you're awake." Carl tried to speak but found his throat dry, almost raw. He croaked, Did we succeed?" Friedrich hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor. "We did, Carl. The behemoth is gone, but not without cost." Carl closed his eyes, the weight of the truth settling like a stone in his chest. He had done what needed to be done, but the cost had been staggering. He had sacrificed his own safety, his future, for the survival of others. But at what cost? The war was still far from over, and the sacrifice of his team, the men who had stood by him, haunted him. "How many?" Carl whispered, his voice cracking as he tried to sit up. Friedrich gently placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him back down. "Only Hans. Lost his life," Friedrich said quietly. "He took a bullet just as we were escaping. It was too late by the time we got him out. The others made it, but there are too many wounds, too much pain." Carl let out a slow, painful breath. Hans, the young soldier, so full of life, who had fought alongside him in countless battles. The one he had tried so hard to save, and now he was gone. Friedrich's hand gripped Carl's tightly. "You did everything you could, Carl. You saved the rest of us. You saved the mission." But even as he said it, Friedrich's voice lacked the conviction of someone who believed in the righteousness of their cause. Both of them knew the truth. No victory, no success, no mission could ever replace the lives lost. There was no honor in the path they had taken. There was no glory in the choices they had made. Carl thought back to the explosion, the flash of light that had consumed everything in its path, and how, in those final moments, he had realized something fundamental. War was not about heroism or ideology. It was not about victory or defeat. It was about survival. And sometimes survival came at the price of your soul. The door opened quietly and an American soldier stepped into the room, his face neutral, professional. Carl tensed, but the soldier only nodded at Friedrich. "Your friend has made a remarkable recovery," the soldier said, his tone distant but not unkind. "There's still time for him to be of use to us. We'll see where this goes, Lieutenant Weber." Carl's heart sank. He had hoped, Foolishly, perhaps, that he would be left to die with his dignity intact, that he would fall for a cause worth fighting for. But now, as he lay here, alive and broken, he realized there would be no dignity, no honor, not anymore. The soldier's words echoed in Carl's mind. We'll see where this goes. His life was no longer his own. He was a tool of war, a prisoner to the decisions made by others, decisions that were not his to make. I don't want to be a pawn anymore, Carl muttered, his voice barely audible. Friedrich sat beside him, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them. None of us do, Carl, but the war doesn't care what we want. The war, it uses us all. The truth of it was simple. The war did not care for morality, for justice, for what was right. It ground everything down to dust, using men as instruments of its endless cycle. But Carl knew this now. He could no longer fight for something he didn't believe in. He couldn't play the game any longer. Friedrich's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on Carl's arm. You did what you thought was right. Don't let them take that from you. Carl didn't answer. The weight of the mission, the loss of his comrades, the betrayal of his own beliefs, it all pressed in on him. He had made a choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say he had to die with them. The war had taken his soul, and there would be no turning back. The door shut softly behind the American soldier, and for a long time, neither man spoke. They simply sat there, each caught in the gravity of the choices they had made. Days passed and Carl's body healed, but his mind remained in turmoil. He was assigned a new role by the Americans, a forced laborer used to help maintain the very machines of war that had destroyed everything he had once fought for. It was a cruel twist of fate, but in some ways it was the only thing left for him. He had become the very thing he had spent his life fighting against. His thoughts often turned inward, to the men he had lost, to the choices he had made, to the war that had taken everything. And as he worked, day after day, with his hands covered in grease and metal, he came to understand something profound about the nature of conflict. It wasn't the battles or the tactics that determined the outcome of war. It was the people, their hearts, their souls, their unrelenting drive to survive. But survival had its cost, and Karl Weber, prisoner of war, could no longer afford to pay it. Inspired by a true letter from 1943, in a letter written from a German prisoner of war to his family, the writer described the overwhelming feeling of hopelessness as he witnessed the industrial might of the Allies. He spoke of his inner conflict, loyalty to his country, the devastation of war, and the loss of purpose as he was used as a tool in a machine that he could not comprehend. The letter ends with a somber reflection. Perhaps the true battle is not for victory, but for the soul of those who fight.